Yeah, you know who it is, and for those of you that don't, I'm Cytonius, the opposite of the phoniest! And I have waited my entire life to be able to use this.
Previously on XMen.
Yo, shout out the season, man. Tell me about the season, man.
All right, man. We gotta run that back, man. We gotta run that back.
Previously on XMen.
Humans, yes. Mutants, no. Humans, yes. Mutants, no.
1992 is probably the most important year in American animation. That's the year that Republican President George H.W. Bush said this.
We are going to keep on trying to strengthen the American family to make American families a lot more like the Waltons and a lot less like the Simpsons.
Huh?
Hey, we're just like the Waltons. We're praying for an end to the Depression, too.
It's also the year that Cartoon Network launched.
Talking tune here.
Boing, boing.
Bam. We're talking tune.
It's the world's first Cartoon Network, 24 hours a day. If you don't have it, contact your cable operator and tell them you want it.
Boing.
Boing!
Bam.
We're talking tune here.
What?
We would also get the groundbreaking Batman the Animated Series. And 1992 would give us the innovative and never correctly duplicated XMen, the Animated Series. For people who might not have been around before what I like to call the Great American Animation Renaissance of 1992, American Saturday morning cartoons were in a pretty bad place. The Real Ghostbusters ended its 7-season run in October of 1991. 1991 is also around the time that the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles cartoon would start to see a decline in popularity. In 1990, Congress would pass the CTA, or Children's Television Act, that would regulate and reduce the amount of non-educational programming that could air on television, i.e., Saturday morning cartoons. As far as comic book superhero cartoons, all we really had was the short-lived and underappreciated Ruby Spears Superman cartoon from 1988. 1989 would produce Pride of the X-Men, a television pilot intended to start an ongoing animated series, but it failed. And from failure and death rises So, enter Fox Kids television producer, Margaret Lesh. Y'all keep pronouncing her name wrong. It's Lesh, not Losh.
Stan and I would have long discussions when I was at Marvel about his favorite characters. And I remember going into him one day and asking him, I mean, obviously Spider-Man is his favorite. But he talked a lot about X-Men because he loved it. We had talked so much about it, that's why I said to him, the first show we'll do is X-Men. And then we're going to do Spider-Man, and then we had other properties to do. So when we started Fox, I waited one season because we had so much to get done. And then I told my boss, I'm going to order X-Men, and he said, And I was really taken aback. I said, well, I thought I had green light authority here and I could make the creative decisions. He said, Margaret, I think that X-Men is a mistake. Why do you believe in it so much? And I told him all the reasons. He says, well, I don't know, I don't really. He says, and I don't see any enthusiasm from you. And I said, well, my enthusiasm is for the shows, not for, I really believe in it. And so he thought it was a mistake. He thought that, again, a comic book, maybe it was too esoteric. I can't remember all the reasons he didn't like it.
Looking back, it's hard to imagine the X-Men being a risky choice for a Saturday morning cartoon, especially considering the fact that the X-Men have been one of the most popular superhero franchises to thrive outside of the comic book industry. August 1991 would see the release of X-Men #1. This would act as a bit of a soft reboot of the X-Men comics. This issue is probably one of the most important X-Men comics in history, and to this day, it stands as the highest selling comic book of all time.
To this day! To this day!
With art from comic book legend Jim Lee, this issue also introduces many of the definitive character designs of the X-Men, with things like Cyclops' blue and yellow suspender uniform and Rogue's green and yellow uniform. Jim Lee's X-Men would also set the foundation for the look and feel of X-Men the Animated Series. The formula to the show's success and everlasting resonance can be attributed to several people, but the main architects of X-Men the Animated Series are writers Eric Lewald and Mark Edward Edens. Eric Lewald would get his start as a writer and director on the 1979 teen college comedy Incoming Freshmen.
Get ready for a dozen sensational young co-eds who turn the campus upside down. Incoming freshmen, ready and eager to learn something that's definitely extracurricular.
I hate to get bogged in with classes when all those new guys are running around.
Incoming freshmen, it's not what you know, but how you make the grade.
When a girl goes off to college, things just sort of change.
Incoming freshmen, rated R.
But due to his work on 80s cartoons like Bionic 6, GoBots, and Chip and Dale's Rescue Rangers that featured an ensemble cast, Eric Lewald would be recruited by producer Sidney Iwanter to work as the head writer and story editor on X-Men the Animated Series. Unlike other American animated cartoons at that time that focused more on formulaic and immature stories and characters, Eric Lewald, who at the start of the show's development didn't know anything about the X-Men, would use elements from Greek mythology and Shakespeare as the framework for the direction of the series. But one of the biggest influences on X-Men the Animated Series is Yep, that's right kids, Gene Roddenberry's Star Trek. Both shows feature a charismatic, diverse cast who all have special skills and expertise and go on galaxy-wide adventures and deal with socially relevant issues like bigotry and prejudice.
It is obvious to the most simple-minded that Loki is of an inferior breed.
The obvious visual evidence, Commissioner, is that he is of the same breed as yourself.
Are you blind, Commander Spock? Well, look at me. Look at me.
You're black on one side and white on the other.
I am black on the right side.
I fail to see the significant difference.
Loki is white on the right side. All of his people are white on the right side.
That does it. All right, wise guy. You and your freako comrades can just hit the road. I don't understand. Is there a problem? I have to serve you jerks from the college, but I ain't putting up with any trouble from their kind.
Skin color prejudice? That's so pathetic. It's almost quaint.
It ain't quaint.
The parallels don't stop there. It's obvious that several X-Men and Star Trek characters are incredibly similar, with characters like Beast being the X-Men equivalent to Spock. Both are pragmatic, quick-witted men of science. Storm is very much the equivalent to Lieutenant Uhura. Both are confident, bold, and compassionate matriarchal characters from African descent. Wolverine is the equivalent to Bones. Both are sardonic and cantankerous, but loyal to the teams they're a part of. For 1992, X-Men was probably one of the most unique animated shows on television. While other kids' cartoons focused on public service announcements that were specific to children about things like drug abuse and stranger danger,
Is your mom there?
No, I'm home alone.
Well, you won a prize. What's your address?
42 Oak Street. Hey, Roblox, some stranger's bringing me a prize.
A stranger, huh? All he wanted to bring you was trouble. Remember, never tell anyone you're home alone, and never give anyone your address.
I'll say Mom can't come to the phone.
Smart thinking.
Now I know.
And knowing is half the battle.
G.I. Joe!
First of fucking all, why the fuck was so many people kidnapping kids in the 80s? Why? Why were y'all motherfuckers kidnapping kids? They don't have no money. Like, what, why? Why? While another popular animated series would debut a year before, and also featured a multicultural cast of heroes that dealt with socially progressive problems, X-Men broke the mold by addressing more adult issues like religion, PTSD, and xenophobia from a far more mature and nuanced perspective. One thing that set X-Men apart from other animated shows of the time was that X-Men had characters filled with angst and situations that had long-lasting consequences. Things such as the death of Morph in the first episode helped the series establish itself as more than just another colorful Saturday morning cartoon. While it seems dated now, at the time, X-Men the Animated Series was the most ambitious, daring, and iconoclastic superhero cartoon on American television. Even more so than Batman the Animated Series. While Batman was dark and edgy like the X-Men, there was still something very traditionalist about Batman. According to Eric Lewald, he compared Batman the Animated Series to smooth jazz, while X-Men was more like heavy metal or punk rock. And much like early punk rock, Eric Lewald wanted to make sure that the show never sold out. The 80s and 90s were filled with cartoons that were created in response to Reagan Era deregulation. What is Reagan Era deregulation, you ask?
You know how very few companies control entire markets? That's because of Ronald Reagan, and the growing wealth gap, he had a hand in that too. At the start of his presidency in the early 1980s, companies outside the US were growing stronger and more efficient, which cost Americans jobs. So Reagan responded by changing the laws that kept monopolies in check, deregulating corporations, and lowering taxes for the private sector so the US could keep up.
Lower our tax rates, deregulation, stimulate new opportunities to make America great again.
Entire shows that were little more than a sales pitch for toys and breakfast cereals aimed at a very vulnerable audience.
Hey dudes, pizza party! Yeah, now our cereal has new pizza-shaped marshmallows. I don't see any marshmallow. Whoa, took 'em!
At last, turtle power is mine.
The pizza marshmallow is mine. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Pizza delivery.
Get them.
Turtle power! Hey, Shredhead, want to help put all the marshmallows back? These guys can handle it.
89, 80, 10, 80, 11. Ninja Turtle cereal is part of your complete breakfast.
He's getting mad. He's getting mean. He's breaking the line for the G.I. Joe team.
That's right, it's William the Refrigerator Perry.
The fridge destroying G.I. Joe.
And you can get a free fridge. Here's how.
Select 5 fridge certificates or call the number on the certificate and the fridge will tell you how to get in on the action. With only 4 certificates, there's a $1 handling charge. See details on specially marked G.I. Joe packages.
Watch out, Cobra. Fridge is coming through.
Yo, Joe!
Man, what the fuck is you talking about?
What the fuck was that?
I'm sorry, man.
I wasn't thinking about it.
First of fucking all, why are y'all using kids to sell refrigerators? Kids don't have any money. Why? 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 What many of us 80s and 90s kids considered the golden age of animation was actually created as right-wing economic agendas designed to keep the rich rich and the poor poor. X-Men the Animated Series would almost fall victim to the same hyper-capitalist game plan that would ruin other cartoon TV shows like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and The Real Ghostbusters. What made X-Men the Animated Series great was that while it was created for kids and to sell toys, The main agenda of the show was to tell great stories with interesting characters and address socially relevant themes. Unlike previous attempts at making superhero team cartoons like Challenge of the Super Friends and Pride of the X-Men, the cast of X-Men the Animated Series represents the dichotomy of having superpowers as both a gift and a curse. Each of the X-Men in the series are defined not just by a strong sense of heroism, but by an underlying life-altering personal tragedy. Rogue is a character that exudes sex appeal and attractiveness, but her power keeps her from touching other people without draining their life force. Wolverine is a character whose mutant power allows him to heal from just about anything, except his PTSD. Each member of the cast brings a different element to the show. A large part of why the cast worked so well was the voices. The 90s did a great job of giving definitive voices to many of the legendary superheroes that we could only see in the pages of a comic book. Actors like the late, great Kevin Conroy would give Batman a voice that still resonates to this day. The same can be said for Christopher Daniel Barnes as Spider-Man. In order for X-Men the Animated Series to work, the core members of the team needed to be interesting and unique, and something that we've never seen on Saturday morning television. In the 60-plus years that the comics have existed, there's been at least 200 members of the X-Men who have all had different interactions and relationships with one another. The team that was chosen for the series was modeled mostly after the blue team from the 1991 X-Men relaunch. That team was chosen by Marvel due to the record-breaking sales of X-Men #1. Marvel wanted to use this series to promote newer and lesser-known characters like Gambit and Jubilee, who had just been created a year or two before the start of the production of the show. What a lot of people may not know is that the team we saw on the animated series was intended to be very different. Early discussions about the team lineup for the show actually included the characters Cable and Thunderbird as main cast members. But this was changed due to both characters who are hard-edged and bad-tempered warriors being too similar to Wolverine. Cable being considered was based on his popularity at the time, and Thunderbird was intended to be killed off in the first episode. But the network decided that it would have been racially insensitive to kill off the only Native American member of the team, and Thunderbird was replaced with Morph. Also, characters like Professor X, Jean Grey, and Beast weren't intended to be main cast members. In fact, this is part of why Beast was locked up for much of the first season. Beast being upgraded to a main cast member was due to the writers loving the character. Marvel and Fox Kids didn't feel like those characters would resonate with the child audience. They thought that kids would struggle to connect with a big, furry, anthropomorphic man-beast. They also thought that kids wouldn't be able to relate to a bald, middle-aged, paraplegic telepath. That won't make sense. While many traditional cartoon voice actors would audition for roles in the series, the voice cast was actually made up of Canadian actors and theater performers who, instead of approaching the series as colorful slapstick cartoon characters, would actually give the voices a level of dignity and humanity that wasn't common for an animated kids show. The formula for why X-Men the Animated Series works as an ensemble is that the main cast are built from the framework of the 12 literary archetypes. What are the 12 literary archetypes?
There are 12 archetypes which have been appearing in stories and myths all over the world since the beginning of time. Carl Jung defined 12 archetypes that symbolize basic human motivations, as well as drive our desires and goals. These archetypes resonate with us so much that we continue to tell stories about them. Moreover, they are featured in just about every blockbuster movie or best-selling novel. Each type has its own set of values, meanings, and personality traits.
Professor X represents the mentor or the sage archetype. He's wise and idealistic. Charles Xavier would be the embodiment of the fatherly, patriarchal spiritual leader of superhero teams in animation that was popularized by characters like Master Splinter and Jaga from Thundercats. Professor X would be voiced by
Cedric Smith, Rose
Thank you very much. Wow, what a trip. Woo. I'm quite stunned. I'd like to thank.
Can't allow you to control my mind. Won't allow you to power. Incredible power.
Yo, shout the season, man. Tell me about the season.
Before X-Men the Animated Series, Cedric Smith was a well-respected Canadian actor who appeared in a wide variety of projects, including the award-winning TV show Road to Avonlea. He also starred in the period drama The Campbells for about 3 seasons. Cyclops represents the hero archetype. He's brave and noble. This version of Cyclops is very much a military-style superhero who is decisive and pragmatic, and exists along the trajectory of other Boy Scout comic book superheroes like Superman and Captain America, who during the 90s saw a major decline in popularity and cultural relevance in favor of more dark and edgy characters like Spawn, Batman, and Ghost Rider. In my opinion, this was a major factor in why Cyclops wasn't a fan favorite character on the show. Cyclops in the series was a straight-laced pretty boy. Cyclops was voiced by the late, great Norm Spencer, who passed away in 2020. Spencer gave Cyclops a voice that felt strong and authoritative, and masculine, but not macho.
Energy blast, huh? Here's one from a pro. I'm taking it out for you.
Speaking of macho.
There you are, Wolverine.
Wolverine represents the outlaw archetype. He's raw and unfiltered, and the personification and poster boy of the dark, violent, and emotionally tortured anti-heroes that dominated 90s comics. Wolverine was the breakout star of the show, and was a major factor in the success of the series. He would be heavily featured in just about every promotional piece related to the show.
Hey, kid. You think you're an X-Man, okay? Name him.
Wolverine, Cyclops, Beast, Gambit, Rogue, Sabretooth, Magneto, Cable, Storm, Professor X, Phoenix, Bishop, Archangel, Apocalypse, Iceman.
You forgot some.
Mr. Sinister, Omega Red, Colossus, Juggernaut, Weapon X, Sauron, Longshot, Pyro, Gladiator.
Name them, join them, collect them. The X-Men collection, sold separately.
What's interesting about Wolverine in the show is that he's actually the most watered down member of the team. In the comics, Wolverine is very, very, very violent. Even his healing factor is watered down.
You're out of line, Professor. All
Sabretooth nearly killed you.
Someday I'll learn not to let my guard down.
Oh no!
Aside from that, this is probably the most comic book accurate version of Wolverine. The main ingredient of Wolverine's everlasting appeal on the series can be attributed to Cathal J. Dodd, or as he's better known, Cal Dodd. Before X-Men, Cal was best known as a singer on the popular Canadian variety show, Circus.
And girls, children of all ages, welcome to Circus! Starring Cal Dodd and Cerise Lawrence.
Clowns and lights and men in tights go fly. Whoa!
While it seems like an obvious choice now, Cal voicing Wolverine is the equivalent of Donny Osmond voicing Batman. No shade to other actors who've brought Wolverine to life in film and animation, but Cal Dodd is what most people probably think of when they imagine how Wolverine would sound. Which is ironic, because Cal Dodd didn't know who or what Wolverine or the X-Men were when he auditioned for the role.
And I'd never done voiceover work, and she called me because I had done a Chrysler commercial where it was a gruff voice that I used. And she remembered me for a year and a half after doing that and phoned me and said, would I be interested in going to audition for a role in a cartoon animated series for the role of Wolverine. I said, who's that? I had no idea who Wolverine was, or an X-Men or anything. Said, fine, sure, I'll go to it. And I went to it, and they said, okay, think Clint Eastwood, Steve McQueen, anyway, and what other names? Ward Bond. I found all these names. That one very unusual, but anyway, so I just took that into my brain and added a little Wolfman Jack, and came up with the line was like, "You like picking on people smaller than you? Well, I'm smaller than you. Pick on me, pal." And like Wolfman Jack's like, "Yeah, baby." So there's a bit of that in his voice. And that's how that happened. And they just all threw up their arms and went, unbelievable. We have our Wolverine.
Remember me, Bright Eyes?
Rogue represents the lover archetype. The lover archetype is characterized by love, but more specifically, romance, beauty, and human connection. Like many of the X-Men in the series, Rogue's mutant power is deeply tied to personal trauma. Rogue is beautiful and romantic, but because of her mutant power, she's unable to touch another person without draining their life force. In fact, I actually think Rogue is more of a subversion of the lover archetype. Rather than being defined by love and intimacy, Rogue is defined by her inability to participate in physical and intimate acts of love and romance. Rogue was voiced by Lenore Zahn, who is a Croatian, Australian, and Canadian actress and politician. Before X-Men the Animated Series, Lenore Zahn was best known for appearing in the 1981 slasher flick Happy Birthday to Me, along with several other 80s era Canadian horror movies. Lenore gives Rogue's voice a sultry, husky southern twang that has become one of Rogue's most defining traits. Another defining trait of Rogue is...
You're corrupt, like all the others. You must be exterminated.
Hey, what up, shawty? What's good with you? You straight, though? I'm just trying to holler at you, you know, I'm just trying to get to know you a little something like that right there, you know what I'm talking about? I want to see you good with it. What's good with you, baby? You got a little booty out there like that, you know what I'm talking about? You act like you want somebody to holler at it. You got to stick it out there like that, you know what I'm talking about?
Storm, mistress of the elements, commands you to release that child.
Storm represents the magician archetype. The magician archetype is characterized by wisdom, intuition, inspiration, and also a mastery of a skill or craft. Storm is a majestic master of the elements. In most media, the magician archetype is the bearer of eye-opening knowledge and usually shares that knowledge with characters in the story.
Come with me, child. I shall explain who we are. All of us here are mutants, like yourself.
Well, tell me this. What is a mutant?
No one knows who will be a mutant at birth. We discover our extraordinary powers at about your age. Professor Xavier is our leader, and he has named us the X-Men.
The true magic of Storm was her voice. In order for the character of Aurora Monroe, aka Storm, the African weather goddess, to work in animation, she needed a voice that exudes grace, respect, and power. During the 5-year run of the series, Storm is actually voiced by 3 different actresses. The original voice of Storm was an unnamed white actress who supposedly voiced the character for the first couple of episodes, but that actress was fired due to concerns about a white actress playing a black character. The second actress to play Storm in the series was Iona Morris.
I don't quite know what you are up to, but I'm gonna be watching you. Every time you turn around, I'm gonna be rolling right behind you. So you be careful, Sparrow.
It's Raven. And what makes you think I'm up to something?
I can smell it. Oh, now sure, honey, to the untrained eye, you look like you got some money. But I know I smell Avon. I smell spam. I smell SWAT meat.
Rogue, take out the wall blasters. Gambit, disable the targeting cameras. You three, stop the walls. I shall slow the ceiling.
Iona Morris would voice Storm for several episodes, but was let go due to contract issues regarding royalties for American voice actors. Because X-Men was a Canadian-produced show, the Canadian voice actors weren't entitled to royalties. Fun fact about Iona Morris, she's actually the older sister of actor Phil Morris, who would go on to play the live-action version of the DC Comics character, Martian Manhunter, on the series Smallville. Iona Morris's version of Storm sounds more subdued and a bit more European, and while it's a decent attempt to bring Storm to life, the final and in my opinion definitive actress to voice Storm would be Barbadian-Canadian actress Alison Seeley Smith. A theatrically trained actress, Alison Seeley Smith gave Storm a boisterous and regal sounding voice.
Nobody was into authenticity at that point. And so I made the best decision, because what I did was I went in there and I happened to do this kind of voice that came straight off of doing Shakespeare in front of 1,800 people on top of this thing, and that's why she's sort of very plummy and round, you know. Listen, Professor Xavier, Sauron has manipulated Rogue's mind. What is North African about that?
Mighty winds and carry us to Jean. Wind and water, whirl and rage. Nature, I command you, bring forth thunder and lightning.
Yes, Queen, slay! Slay! Slay your enemies, ruler of one of the realms of men! Smite down those that oppose you!
Blue Boy, get those doors open.
My name is Mr. McCoy, madam, not Blue Boy.
Beast represents the creator archetype. The creator archetype is characterized through innovative and imaginative thinking. This coincides with Beast being the brains of the team. Beast is kind, gentle, and intelligent. This acts as a contrast to his physical appearance. As the pacifist of the team, Beast is the least likely to use violence as a means of conflict resolution. But when he has to, he will fuck you up. Beast was voiced by George Busey.
But can you talk about where the origins of your version of Beast came from, of Hank McCoy?
Well, as in any actor's formation of a character, he bases it on his own experiences and his own personality. And the two of them seem to have really meshed, because a lot of the experiences that I had as a child of being bullied and everything like in that vein was very much the same tone that we were trying to portray in X-Men. So it wasn't that difficult to find that balance that Hank McCoy had, because I had the same problems as a kid.
Early in the development of the series, producers imagined the voice of Beast as being similar in tone to writer and political commentator William Buckley Jr. But Busey decided to use his natural voice to bring the character to life. While many people looked at Cyclops as the opposite side of Wolverine, I would actually argue that it's Beast that's the counterpoint to Wolverine. Beast is calm and well-mannered, while Wolverine is not.
Everyone can relax. Gambit has returned.
Gambit represents the explorer archetype. The explorer is characterized by freedom, independence, and adventure. And if that doesn't accurately describe Remy LeBeau, then I don't know what does. Gambit is the wild card of the team. Pun intended. He's unpredictable and mysterious. Not much is known about Gambit's past in the series. This is mainly due to the fact that Gambit was created less than 2 years before the series debuted, and he only made a handful of appearances in the comics up to that point. The series played an important role in not just Gambit's popularity outside of the comics, but in helping to define who Gambit is as a character. Gambit first appeared in Uncanny X-Men 266 in 1990 and was created by writer Chris Claremont and artists Mike Collins and Jim Lee. Claremont's original intention was for Gambit to be revealed as a clone of Mr. Sinister, who infiltrated the X-Men and fell in love with Rogue. But because Claremont left the X-Men books back in '91, 1 year before the start of the series, a lot of Gambit's personality and backstory would be fleshed out in the show. While this version of Gambit is accurate to his portrayal in the comics, things like his close friendship with Storm would be downplayed in the animated series. The closest reference to their friendship is this line from the episode Days of Future Past Part 2.
Gambit, I know you better than anyone. But even if Bishop had accused me, I would not know that he was lying.
In the comics, it was actually Storm that recruited Gambit into the X-Men after she was turned into a kid. You know what? I'm not talking about that. The most significant and honestly most popular relationship from the series, and maybe even from the comics, was Gambit and Rogue. The reason their relationship was so appealing was that it was rooted in two major tropes from love stories: romantic tension and forbidden love. One of the major factors of the X-Men's popularity in the 90s was that the X-Men made comic books sexy. I mean, look at this shit. Rogue and them had motherfuckers bricked up for real.
Mr. Burgundy, you have a massive erection.
Really? Yes, I do. I'm sorry, it's the pleats.
Gambit and Rogue are the purest representation of the theme of contrasting and opposite personalities and powers that's so prominent in the series. Gambit charges objects with energy, and Rogue drains the energy of humans and mutants. Gambit was voiced by Chris Potter, a well-respected actor who many people might remember from the cult 90s television series Kung Fu: The Legend Continues, alongside David Carradine. Fun fact, this was actually one of my favorite shows as a teenager. Potter gives Gambit's voice that definitive Louisiana swamp rat twang that the character has become famous for.
Oh, seriously, what I did was, I knew a little bit about the Cajun patois, and I thought, well, how do I develop this voice quickly? We really didn't know what they were looking for because the show was called The X Project when they presented it to us and were casting way back when. So I knew that as born Canadian and being surrounded by French Canadian, that a big portion of the Cajun patois involved French. So I took a little bit of the Canadian French slang and a little bit of that southern Louisiana deep south dialect and blended the two, gave it a whirl, and basically was pretty much insecure about what I'd put together the entire time I did the series. But I'm finding out that it resonated with some people.
The series made Gambit a household name and a fan favorite member of the X-Men. And if you don't believe me, try watching this. And if you don't get chills, you're not a real person.
The name is Gambit. Remember it.
What's so wrong with being a mutant anyway? No, not again.
Hey, you! Do you know how much that game costs?
Yeah, a quarter.
Jubilee represents the innocent archetype. The innocent archetype is characterized by purity and optimism. As the youngest member of the team, Jubilee acts as both a daughter figure to characters like Professor X, Wolverine, and Storm, and as a little sister figure to characters like Gambit, Rogue, and Cyclops. While Jubilee wasn't a fan favorite character, mainly due to the fact that she was the one X-Man in the series that had the least amount of angst and pathos, Jubilee actually helps to emphasize the most important aspect of the X-Men, that I think is missing from a lot of other superhero teams. And that's the concept of superhero teams as found family. Unlike other superhero groups like the Justice League and Avengers, which seem more like a bunch of co-workers saving the day, the X-Men have far more intimate and interpersonal relationships that exist on a wide spectrum, with everything from marriage to BFFs to surrogate parental connections. In the series, Jubilee acts as a replacement for the character Kitty Pryde, who is one of the most popular, important, and influential members of the X-Men to not appear in the series. Kitty Pryde's erasure was due to several factors. The most well-known was that producers blamed Kitty Pryde for the failure of the animated series Pride of the X-Men. Another reason was Kitty Pryde's declining popularity in the comics in the late 80s and early 90s. Because Kitty Pryde was created as an avatar for teenage girls of the 80s, she didn't align with the 90s aesthetics that X-Men the Animated Series was trying to embrace. Jubilee, though, was the epitome of a 90s teenager. She was a spunky mall rat who wore shades she probably got at a Bret the Hitman Hart match.
And the Hitman Bret Hart gives this little lady, just as he did a moment ago, a pair of his signature sunglasses, and that's the effect of it.
Jubilee was voiced by Allison Court.
Hey, how you doing?
Most people probably remember Allison Court as Lunette from The Big Comfy Couch. But I remember her from another show.
Though I know I should be wary, still I venture someplace scary. Ghostly haunting, I turn loose. Beetlejuice! Beetlejuice! Beetlejuice!
What's anybody waiting for? He needs us.
Sit down, kid. You're not going.
I'm not a kid anymore. I'm one of you, one of the X-Men, and it means more to me than anything in the world.
Jean represents the useless archetype.
It's crucial. Jean!
Can I skip this one? Can I skip Jean Grey?
No, Cytonius, you can't.
World famous YouTuber and all around great guy Godzilla Mendoza? Is that you?
Yes! That's awesome!
Well, look, I don't think I can do this. I know she's an important character and everything, but all she does is make Canadian phone sex noises.
Some kind of device. 5,
Too strong.
3.
I've got you.
And faint like I would at a Taylor Swift concert.
I know she kind of sucks in this show, but she's better in the new season, and she's still a super important character, and a lot of the best arcs of the show are kind of revolving around her, because, like, the Phoenix stuff is really cool. Okay, yeah, come on, you can do it.
You can do it! Cover Winkler in bees. You can do it. You can do it! You can do it! You can do it all night long! You can do it! You can do it!
Yeah. You know what? You're right, Xavier. Yes, I can do this. So, with that being said, Jean Grey represents the caretaker archetype. The caretaker archetype is characterized by generosity, self-sacrifice, and empathy, which is fitting with Jean Grey's powers of telepathy. Jean Grey is the emotional center of the team. She's the most compassionate and caring member of the X-Men. Jean Grey is the most unique member of the X-Men because she's the only member who isn't defined by personal tragedy and trauma. While Cyclops has abandonment issues and Storm has claustrophobia and Wolverine has post-traumatic stress syndrome, Jean is actually the most emotionally stable member of the team. While it might not seem like it, Jean Grey is actually one of the most revolutionary female characters in comics. While many people associate the X-Men with progressive racial civil rights allegories, one of the most underappreciated socio-political themes of the franchise is feminism. The X-Men is the first team in superhero comics to emphasize what many people would label as girl power. Characters like Storm, Kitty Pryde, Rogue, Psylocke, Polaris, and Rachel Summers exist as some of the most powerful and culturally relevant characters in comics, and all of those characters owe that relevance to Jean Grey. It would be the Phoenix and Dark Phoenix sagas that would solidify Jean Grey as one of the most important female characters in comics. The Phoenix saga would take Jean Grey, who at the time was probably the most milquetoast and understated member of the X-Men, and turn her into the most powerful being in the universe. Until Goku showed up. The reason I'm mentioning all of this is because Jean Grey wasn't intended to be a major part of the series. She was initially supposed to just be a glorified background character. This is because the financiers of the show, Saban Entertainment, didn't feel like Jean Grey would appeal to the preteen and early teen boy demographic that the show was aiming for. Which is ironic, because X-Men the Animated Series had a massive female following. In my opinion, the show doesn't work without Jean Grey. Like, imagine this show without the Phoenix Saga. Speaking of the Phoenix Saga, X-Men the Animated Series is the only adaptation of that storyline that's actually great. No shade to X-Men The Last Stand, or Dark Phoenix, or X-Men Evolution, or Wolverine and the X-Men. But when people think of the best adaptation of the Phoenix Saga, they think of this show. This show also doesn't work without producer and animation director, Larry Houston. A pioneer of American kids animation, Larry Houston would be one of the first black animation storyboard artists to work on Marvel Comics cartoons during the 80s, working on shows like Thundar the Barbarian and Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends, which ironically is the first animated appearance of the X-Men.
We're very happy to have you back, even for a short visit.
It's wonderful to see you again, Professor.
Firestar, over here.
Coming, Cyclops.
This is our other new member, Wolverine.
How you doing? Want a piece of fruit?
Larry Houston would also be responsible for creating one of the most iconic animation intros of all time. No, not that one. This one. The opening intro to X-Men the Animated Series is probably one of the greatest and most iconic cartoon intros of all time, and one of the most imitated of its era. This series would also produce one of the best Japanese intros to an American cartoon of all time. The intro to X-Men the Animated Series would have three major creative forces: Larry Houston, artist and producer Will Mineo, and music composer Ron Wasserman. Wasserman pretty much defined 90s kids animation, and he did it with two themes: Mighty Morphin Power Rangers and X-Men the Animated Series. Unfortunately, all that glitters ain't gold. Marvel would be sued by a representative of the composer of the Hungarian television show Linda, who accused Marvel and Wasserman of stealing the theme from that show. In order for X-Men the Animated Series to have the cultural significance and impact it had on helping the X-Men cross over into the mainstream, it would need to have great villains. And much like how the show helped to popularize many of the X-Men, it did the same for the villains. Before 1992, no one outside of your local comic book store knew who or what a Magneto was. Before X-Men the Animated Series introduced the world to Magneto, most supervillains were mustache-twirling megalomaniacs obsessed with world domination. Magneto changed pop culture by becoming one of the first mainstream sympathetic supervillains. The philosophy that Magneto was right is a concept that was popularized by his appearances in this show. In the same way that the X-Men represent the literary archetypes, one could argue that the villains represent the four types of evil. What are the four types of evil? The four types of evil are a psychoanalytic theory that was developed by psychologist Roy Baumeister. The four types of evil are demonic, instrumental, foolish, and idealistic. Magneto represents idealistic evil, which is evil that's justified by a greater noble purpose.
Too long have we suffered under the oppression of humankind. I have witnessed firsthand the barbarous treatment of mutants on your wretched little island. I will not allow this madness to continue.
Fool, you still dream of peace with those who would destroy all mutants?
Is this your answer? This horror? After all the suffering we both have seen, you wish me to wage war on 6 billion humans?
When I was a child, my people talked while others prepared for war. They used reason while others used tanks, and they were destroyed for their trouble. I won't stand by and watch it happen again.
The philosophical dichotomy between Professor X and Magneto is one of the most potent ideological conflicts in modern pop culture, and this series helped to popularize it. Magneto's militant stance on mutant separatism and Professor X's stance of integration and tolerance is an everlasting debate that'll never get old to me. And it's also a debate that doesn't have a clear-cut answer. Magneto was voiced by the late, great David Hemblin, who passed away in 2020. Hemblin was another Canadian theater-trained actor who worked on the series and injected Magneto's voice with a powerful, commanding, and confident tone that fits the character so well and set the foundation for what great actors like Ian McKellen and Michael Fassbender would do with the character in the live-action movies. Fun fact, David Hemblin was actually the original choice for Magneto in the Bryan Singer X-Men movies, but had to turn it down due to scheduling conflicts with the TV show Earth: Final Conflict. The other most prominent villain in the series is En Sabin Nur, or, as he's better known, Apocalypse. Apocalypse represents instrumental evil, which is evil that occurs out of circumstance and not intent. Apocalypse operates under the Darwinian philosophy of survival of the fittest. Like Magneto, Apocalypse is incredibly nuanced.
The world won't stomach your evil forever.
Evil? I am not malevolent. I simply am.
You know, I'm Mike. You know, I'm not malevolent or anything. I just am.
Apocalypse believes that mankind has become weak and wants to start a war between humans and mutants in hopes that they destroy each other so that he can create a stronger, new race in his image. Apocalypse was so powerful that he was voiced by two different actors. The first actor to voice Apocalypse was sci-fi legend John Colicos. Colicos being cast as Apocalypse was a bit of stunt casting by the producers. Colicos appeared as Commander Kor in the 1960 Star Trek series and its spin-off Deep Space Nine. Kor is actually the first Klingon, like ever, much like how Apocalypse was the very first mutant. The second actor to voice Apocalypse was James Blendick, who took over for John Colicos after season 2. X-Men the Animated Series would be the first cross-media appearance of Apocalypse. Before the animated series, Apocalypse was technically not an official X-Men villain. He was actually a villain of the X-Men spin-off team, XFactor. No, not that XFactor. This XFactor. The original incarnation of XFactor was a team made up of the 5 original X-Men, who became a mutant recruitment squad that was separate from the regular X-Men team, who were actually considered criminals due to the fact that Magneto had taken over the team. X-Men the Animated Series would contribute greatly to his mainstream popularity and relevance. Because of this series, Apocalypse would appear in just about every form of X-Men related media, such as other animated shows like X-Men Evolution and Wolverine and the X-Men, and the live-action film X-Men Apocalypse. The third and most recurring villain in the series would be Nathaniel Essex, or, as he's better known,
my name is Sinister. Mr. Sinister.
Mr. Sinister represents demonic evil, which is evil that's carried out for the sake of evil. Much like Apocalypse, Mr. Sinister is motivated by Darwinian evolution. In fact, Mr. Sinister was a peer of Charles Darwin. Nathaniel Essex was born in the 1800s and was a geneticist obsessed with human mutation. Unlike Magneto, who's portrayed as more sympathetic, Mr. Sinister is pure evil, and unlike Apocalypse, who's a physically imposing force of nature, Mr. Sinister is more cerebral and less of a physical threat. What's interesting to me about Mr. Sinister is that, much like many of the X-Men villains who are ideologically driven by concepts of ethnic and genetic superiority, Mr. Sinister is very much driven by the philosophy of eugenics. While there are countless articles discussing the civil rights allegory of the X-Men, there are very few conversations about how the X-Men address concepts like Nazi eugenics. For those not familiar, eugenics is a pseudoscience that focuses on genetic purity and ethnic cleansing, and gained prominence during the early 20th century and was a major factor in the persecution and extermination of the Jewish people during the Holocaust. This version of Mr. Sinister is a lot less sinister than the comic book version. In the comics, especially during the late 80s and 90s, Mr. Sinister is the closest thing to the devil as far as X-Men villains are concerned. Mr. Sinister is responsible for the murder of the Morlocks during the storyline The Mutant Massacre. And he's also responsible for creating the Jean Grey clone, Madeline Pryor, who eventually becomes the X-Men villain, the Goblin Queen. In the series, Mr. Sinister is definitely the primary arch-enemy of Cyclops and Jean Grey, and Morph. And I guess now would be the best time to talk about Morph. Morph is an interesting character in the show because his entire reason for being in the series was to be cannon fodder to be killed off to show that, unlike other cartoons, X-Men the Animated Series had dangerous stakes. But in a twist of fate, Morph wound up becoming a fan-favorite character and was resurrected in the series. Many people thought that Morph was actually a character that was made up for the show, but he was actually a revised version of the X-Men character Kevin Sidney, who was a reformed villain named Changeling, who joined the X-Men and would become the first X-Man to die in battle. Because the name Changeling was already being used by the DC Comics character Gar Logan in the popular Teen Titans, the name Morph would be used to avoid a lawsuit from DC, which was smart. While many of the X-Men in the show dealt with personal tragedy, it would be Morph that would be the most tragic of all of the X-Men in the show. Morph's story arc in the series has him being killed, manipulated by Mr. Sinister, and dealing with severe, PTSD.
No! He's my friend! They were all my friends. I don't want to hurt them. Ah! But why did they abandon me? Why did they leave me to die?
You will destroy them all.
I'll destroy them all. All the X-Men. Cyclops. Storm. Wolverine! What's making me do this? Why?
A lot of Morph's personality and even his appearance shares a lot of similarities with Jim Carrey, who, in 1992, when X-Men the Animated Series aired, was a breakout star of the popular sketch comedy show In Living Color. Morph's ability to shapeshift and his sense of humor is almost identical to Jim Carrey. As far as the fourth type of evil, which is foolish evil, which is evil that occurs because of incompetence, well, I can't really think of any characters that line up with that. Some of y'all might be thinking of characters like Mojo because he's a goofy character, or Trevor Fitzroy because, well, look at that motherfucker. But the X-Men have one of the best rogues galleries in comics. Characters like Mystique, Sabretooth, the Juggernaut, the Sentinels, the Hellfire Club, and so many more have been some of the greatest antagonists in modern pop culture. And just about every X-Men villain that existed at the time the series aired appeared in the show, with a few exceptions like Reverend William Stryker and the Purifiers. Great Creed and the Friends of Humanity act as stand-ins for those characters, possibly due to concerns over portraying a religious figure as a villain. Another missing X-Men villain is Irene Adler, aka Destiny, who was very close to Mystique. Very close. Destiny wasn't included in the series to avoid any implications of a same-sex relationship with Mystique. Censorship was a major factor in the direction and development of the show. Broadcasting standards and practices kept X-Men from being a lot less sexy than the comics. Characters like Lady Deathstrike would be given a much less revealing design for the show. The Sentinels would also be heavily featured in the series as villains that the X-Men could slice, punch, and destroy without any pushback from censors, since they're robots and not human beings. X-Men the Animated Series would not only adapt famous storylines from the comics, they would actually take those stories and make them mainstream. Much of the series is influenced by the legendary comics run of Chris Claremont, who wrote X-Men and many of the spin-off titles for over 15 years. The series would adapt many of Claremont's legendary stories like the groundbreaking Days of Future Past. The animated series would change the subtext of the story from a post-apocalyptic Holocaust allegory that starred the Jewish character Kitty Pryde to a Terminator-style story starring the character Bishop. This change was made to piggyback off of the success of the film Terminator 2: Judgment Day, which came out a year before the series aired. The show would also feature one of the best adaptations of the popular Dark Phoenix saga, another X-Men comic written by Chris Claremont. By the way, we don't need any more attempts at trying to adapt the Phoenix saga. They were all bad. We've seen enough. Thanks. Other Claremont comic adaptations like Uncanny X-Men 268 titled Madripoor Nights would act as the inspiration for the episode Old Soldiers. Uncanny X-Men issue 269 would act as the inspiration for the episode A Rogue's Tale, which in my opinion is one of the best episodes of the series and gives us details about Rogue's origin. Another important comics writer that would work on the series would be the late, great Len Wein, the co-creator of Wolverine. Len wrote several episodes of the series, including one of my personal favorites, the Season 2 episode Repo Man, which would be a loose adaptation of Uncanny X-Men issue 121 and Alpha Flight issue 17, that features Wolverine being captured by his former teammates, Alpha Flight, who want him to rejoin the team. My personal favorite episode of the show is Weapon X Lies in Videotape. The name of the episode is a reference to the 1989 film Sex, Lies, and Videotape. But the plot of the episode is borrowed from Wolverine issue 48, 49, and 50. While many plots from the comics inspired the show would also inspire the comics. The year-long comic book storyline Age of Apocalypse would draw inspiration from the episode One Man's Worth, which focused on Trevor Fitzroy going back in time to kill Charles Xavier. The death of Professor X would create an alternate reality where Magneto leads the X-Men, and the Avengers are agents of Apocalypse. In the comics, the death of Charles Xavier happens by accident. When the Mutant Legion goes back in time to kill Magneto, he accidentally kills his father, Professor X, which creates the Age of Apocalypse timeline. With the show being an ensemble cast with over 7 main characters, Eric Lewald and his writing team cleverly used less than 4 X-Men per episode to save the animators the struggle of having to draw 7 X-Men fighting and talking in each episode. This trick also kept the stories tight and streamlined, and is probably why X-Men sometimes feels like an anthology series that focuses on 2 or 3 specific characters per episode. X-Men the Animated Series would also help to popularize Easter eggs and cameos, with the show being the first non-comic appearance of characters like Deadpool and Carol Danvers. Because the show focused on 9 primary X-Men, while the comics had a constantly rotating and changing team lineup, many of the popular and well-loved X-Men members were reduced to glorified cameos, such as fan favorites like Colossus, Nightcrawler, and Psylocke. While I do love the series, I think a major flaw of the show is that it downplays the international aspects of the franchise that made the X-Men one of the most diverse, unique, and universal superhero comics of all time. While the show is far more diverse than a lot of other kids' cartoons at the time, the show still featured a mostly American and mostly white lineup of characters. While the animation is dated and at times very cheap looking, due to the budget per episode being less than $1 million, X-Men the Animated Series circumnavigates that by having well-written stories and unique and interesting characters. Much of the series was animated by the Korean animation studio ACOM, who does their best to mimic the hyper-detailed, cross-hatching anime-influenced art style of Jim Lee. Even though it's really easy to see the limitations of the animators, this will be taken to the next level with Season 5. The show was supposed to end with Season 4, but due to the popularity of the series, Fox ordered another season. But due to Graz Entertainment and Marvel, who were the financiers of the show, going bankrupt, much of Season 5 was outsourced to Philippines Animation Studio Incorporated, who was a cheaper studio with less experienced animators. X-Men the Animated Series would end with Season 5. While there were plans for a 6th season, the show ended due to Marvel's bankruptcy in the late 90s. The impact of X-Men the Animated Series on pop culture is enormous. It would serve as the inspiration for the Bryan Singer X-Men movies of the early 2000s, which, despite how mediocre those movies are, helped popularize the X-Men and comic book films for the 21st century. As far as 90s animation, X-Men would exist as the precursor to anime. It would be the first major network cartoon to use consistent serialized storytelling, redemption arcs, and plots directly inspired by the comics, in the same way that anime uses manga as the template for its animated content. And X-Men the Animated Series would be a major factor in the rise of another 90s kids superhero franchise. The success of X-Men allowed Margaret Lesh and Haim Saban to get the green light for the American adaptation of the Japanese series Koryu Sentai Zyuranger, or as it's better known, Mighty Morphin Power Rangers. And most importantly, X-Men would be the jump off for the Marvel animation renaissance of the 90s, with shows like Spider-Man, Fantastic Four, Iron Man, The Incredible Hulk, Silver Surfer, and Avengers United They Stand, which was not good, being adapted into animated television. So, what else is there for me to say about X-Men the Animated Series? Well, honestly, I could think of some stuff. Or I could follow this video up with a video about X-Men 97.